They say nations collapse in chaos with riots, flames, and sudden catastrophe, but the truth is far more unsettling. The real collapse doesn't begin at the bottom. It begins at the top. It starts when a country looks invincible, when its people believe the worst is behind them, when its leaders think they've conquered history itself. Because buried inside every peak is a silent countdown, a clock that starts ticking long before the first crack appears. And the most disturbing part is that this countdown repeats across centuries, across empires, across political systems, as if every nation is unknowingly following the same four-phase path toward decline. Once you see this pattern, you can never unsee it. The clock always begins in the same place, the illusion of absolute strength. A nation reaches its height, its golden moment, the point where it believes collapse is impossible. Rome understood this illusion better than anyone. At its peak, the empire controlled vast territories, commanded unmatched military power, and possessed a level of engineering and administration the world hadn't seen before. Citizens believed the empire had reached permanent stability, but what no one noticed was that this peak was also the moment the countdown started. The first phase is always the peak that disguises itself as stability. It's the calm before anything even looks wrong, the moment when people stop imagining danger. In Rome's case, prosperity concealed the early fractures. A widening gap between the elite and ordinary citizens emerged quietly, too subtle for most to notice. The economy began depending more on conquered wealth than on internal productivity, creating a fragile system hidden beneath outward strength. Armies stretched thin across borders. Political alliances grew unstable. But because Rome still appeared dominant, most dismissed these as manageable problems. The fracture phase is silent and visible to people living through it. They see the cracks, but convince themselves they're temporary. This illusion lasted decades. Rome still looked powerful on maps, but inside, the structure was weakening. As pressure built, the fractures accelerated. Resources became strained. Political infighting intensified. Corruption spread. External threats found more openings. And yet, the majority still believed Rome was eternal. This is how the panic phase begins, not with disaster, but with slow realization. Small disruptions start triggering outsized reactions. A military defeat that once would have been minor becomes a national shock. A grain shortage suddenly feels like a warning. The sense of invincibility erodes, but the population cannot understand why everything feels unstable all at once. Panic is the moment people finally look back and realize the countdown had been running the entire time. But by then, it's too late. The final phase begins. And Rome, after centuries of dominance, moved from subtle cracks to full breakdown. The collapse didn't feel like a single event. It felt like a long unraveling, a slow-motion fall that nobody could stop. This same pattern reappeared centuries later in the British Empire. At its height, Britain ruled a quarter of the world. Cities, seas, and trade routes bent to its influence. The empire believed it had engineered a system so efficient, so far-reaching, that it would last for generations. This was the peak, the moment of supreme confidence. But inside that confidence were the same silent fractures that had once destabilized Rome. Costly wars drained finances. Industrial competition from rising nations challenged economic dominance. Social tensions grew inside the empire's core. These cracks were faint, scattered, and easy to ignore. London still glowed with wealth. The British Navy still dominated the world's oceans. No one thought decline had already begun. As the 20th century arrived, the fractures widened. The global economy shifted, and Britain struggled to maintain the enormous weight of its empire. Internal political debates intensified. The cost of global administration became unsustainable. Many believed the empire still had decades of rule ahead. But beneath the surface, the panic phase was building. Small economic shocks hit harder than expected. Colonial resistance grew. Structural weaknesses that had been invisible for years suddenly became undeniable. When World War II arrived, it didn't create the breakdown. It simply accelerated a collapse that had already entered its final phase. The empire that once looked unshakable dissolved piece by piece. The countdown that began at the peak ended in a world where British dominance became history. Spain experienced the same pattern centuries earlier. It emerged from its golden age wealthier than any European power, fueled by massive inflows of silver and global influence. This was Spain's moment of triumph, its peak. But that silver hit a fragile economic foundation. The wealth wasn't built on sustainable productivity. It created inflation, dependence, and vulnerability. Spain looked unstoppable, yet the fracture phase had already begun. The economy hollowed out. Resources were mismanaged. Foreign competition strengthened. Political strains intensified. These cracks were faint at first, overshadowed by the illusion of golden prosperity. As decades passed, the fractures accelerated. Spain's overextended empire became difficult to govern. External pressures mounted. Debt grew. The panic phase emerged when small defeats suddenly felt catastrophic. Internal unrest increased. influence vanished faster than leaders could react. Spain entered its breakdown phase, losing territories, power, and global relevance. People living through it didn't understand how their once dominant empire had unraveled so quickly. But the pattern had been the same. The countdown started at the peak, not at the decline. The Soviet Union followed this script with chilling accuracy. After World War II, it appeared strong, united, and ideologically powerful. Its industrial capacity grew. Its military became one of the most formidable in the world. Citizens believed they were living in a superpower destined to shape global history. This was the peak, a moment defined by confidence and the belief that the system was unbreakable. But the fractures were already spreading. Economic inefficiencies deepened. Central planning concealed critical weaknesses. Political repression masked social dissatisfaction. Environmental strain increased. The illusion of stability was powerful enough that few noticed the quiet countdown underway. When the fractures reached a tipping point, pressure escalated. Small shortages triggered widespread anxiety. Internal dissent intensified. Structural weaknesses that had been invisible became impossible to hide. The panic phase erupted when the economy faltered, and the government could no longer sustain its control. Citizens watched the system they had believed was invincible suddenly wobble. The breakdown came rapidly, with the Soviet Union dissolving into separate nations. To the outside world, the collapse appeared sudden. But it was not. The clock had been running for decades. Argentina's story reveals a different but equally telling version of the same countdown. It was once one of the most prosperous nations in the world, a country with immense natural resources, rising industries, and global economic potential. This was its peak. But internal fractures emerged quietly. Political instability grew. Debt reliance increased. Inflation crept upward. Citizens believed these were temporary problems, assuming prosperity would continue. But the fractures compounded until panic broke out. Financial crises hit repeatedly, each shock triggering deeper instability. The breakdown phase resurfaced multiple times, showing that a nation can restart the countdown again and again if it never repairs its structural weaknesses. Japan offers another compelling case. In the 1980s, Japan reached extraordinary economic heights. Its corporations dominated global markets. Its technology outpaced much of the world. Investors believed Japan would surpass every major economy. This was its peak, defined by confidence and unprecedented growth. But beneath that success, fractures were quietly forming. Asset prices inflated far beyond sustainable levels. Banks took on hidden risks. The economy became dependent on speculative momentum. People dismissed concerns, assuming Japan's rise was permanent. When the fractures could no longer be ignored, panic emerged. The asset bubble burst. Markets collapsed. Banks suffered devastating losses. The economy entered a prolonged stagnation that surprised the world. The breakdown wasn't a sudden collapse, but a long, grinding stagnation that reshaped Japan's future. Once again, the countdown had begun at the peak, not at the crisis. Across all these examples, the pattern remains disturbingly consistent. A nation's moment of greatest confidence hides its deepest vulnerabilities. People mistake the high point for safety, not realizing it is the moment the countdown begins. The early fractures always look small. They appear manageable. They can be explained away. Leaders assure citizens that things are under control. Economists debate whether the problems are temporary. Historians later call this period the moment everyone should have paid attention. But at the time, few do. The panic phase can take many shapes. Sometimes it is triggered by financial instability, sometimes by political upheaval, sometimes by external pressure. But the common thread is the same. Small disruptions reveal the hidden weakness of the system. Panic spreads when people realize the stability they trusted was more fragile than they imagined. By the time panic emerges, the countdown is already deep into its final stages. Breakdown becomes unavoidable. Modern systems show similar pressures today. Global economies face debt burdens, political divisions, and structural risks that echo earlier periods of fracture. Wealth concentration increases. Social tensions rise. The world becomes more interconnected, making systems more fragile to external shocks. These are not predictions. They are parallels. Historical patterns that resurface whenever nations approach their peaks. And when a small disruption hits a fragile structure, the countdown accelerates. The unsettling truth is that collapse rarely feels like collapse until the very end. It feels like confusion, tension, instability, and uncertainty. It feels like leaders insisting everything is fine. It feels like people debating whether the problems are temporary. It feels like systems that once looked unbreakable beginning to react unpredictably to small events. And then, suddenly, the moment arrives when everyone realizes the structure has already crossed the point of no return. If history teaches one lesson, it is this. Collapse doesn't begin when everything falls apart. Collapse begins at the peak, when people believe nothing can go wrong, when confidence blinds societies to their early fractures, when prosperity turns into complacency. When the clock starts ticking quietly, unnoticed by those who trust the illusion of stability. The collapse clock has repeated across centuries, across cultures, across empires and modern nations alike. And once you understand the pattern, you start noticing the same pressures forming in unexpected places. You see rising peaks that look unshakable. You see fractures that appear small. You see panic emerging faster than people expect. You see systems reacting sharply to disruptions that once would have been easy to absorb. You see the same countdown forming again. The real question is not whether nations collapse. The real question is when their countdown begins, and whether anyone notices before it reaches its final phase. Tell me in the comments, do you think the collapse clock is already running today? Which of these historical collapses shocked you the most? And should I make a part 2?